It would be simple to say the ruin began the night the Alpha King wed the cursed girl to punish her. But if Alaric had known what his own bare hands could do, he would never have needed to punish her at all. He would have knelt. So whatever came after, the guilt was his. And his alone. Every last frozen inch of it. Isora of Coldreach had learned to keep her hands to herself before she had learned her letters. It was the first rule and the only one that mattered, and she had never broken it. Bare skin on bare skin, and the cold in her went out like a tide, and whatever it touched did not warm again. A hen. A hedge of green thornbush gone black and brittle in an afternoon. Once, a boy who had grabbed her wrist to be cruel. She did not think about the boy. She thought about her gloves, which she checked twice each morning and twice each night, the way other people checked that a door was barred. They had a use for a girl like that in Coldreach, and it was the lowest there was. She tended the dead. In a country where the winter killed more than the summer fed, someone had to lay out the frozen and close the eyes gone to glass, and Isora could do it without fear, because she was already the most dangerous thing in the room. The dead did not flinch when she came near. They were the only company that never looked at her as though she were a blade left carelessly on a table. So she knew cold, the way a smith knows fire, in the hand and the bone. She knew the blue that came to a lip when the breath froze in the chest, and the different blue when the heart simply stopped, and the gray between the two that 100 living men would never learn to tell apart. It was the one thing she was truly good at, and it was about to condemn her. She had been sent north to Hallgrave in the border tithe, a wagon of Coldreach servants owed to the crown each spring, and given the ice house in a corner no one wanted. She had meant to keep her head down until the tithe was paid and go home. She had not meant to be standing in the great grey hall of the Iron Wolf on the day the new Alpha King was confirmed before his lords. But the hall needed hands, and hers were counted. So she stood at the edge of it with a tray, gloved and silent, watching a kingdom she would never belong to raise its young king to the seat his father had left him. Alaric of Venmark was tall and still in the way of a man not yet certain whether grief had made him hard or only tired. And at his side, laughing, warm, entirely alive, stood the one soft thing in that cold hall. His sister, Sunniva, they called her. And the whole court loved her the way you love the first mild day after a long winter. Isara would remember afterward that Sunniva had smiled at her. Not the flinch, not the sign against ill luck. A smile, small and unbothered, from a girl who did not know enough to be afraid. Then, Sunniva swayed. Her cup slipped from her fingers and rang on the stone. She reached out, and the nearest hand was a gloved one, and Isora moved the way she had been taught never to move, and caught the girl by the shoulders and eased her down. Sunniva was dead before her knees touched the floor. The hall did not understand at once. Then someone saw the blue at the girl's lips, and the frost, actual frost, blooming white across the collar where a cursed woman's hands had closed, and the understanding ran through the room like a crack through river ice. Isara knelt there with a dead princess in her arms and knew, with the clean certainty of the only thing she had ever been good at, that this was not her doing. The blue was wrong. The frost was wrong. This death wore cold like a stolen cloak, and under it was something else. Something she had smelled once before over a very different table. But there was no one in that hall who would hear it. They had already found their answer, and it knelt on the floor wearing her gloves. The king came down from the high seat one slow step at a time. He did not shout. Isara almost wished he would. He crouched and touched his sister's grave face with a gentleness that undid something in her chest, and when he looked up, his eyes were the pale gray of a sky with no warmth left anywhere in it. Behind him, a soft voice said, so kindly, "Take the creature out and be done with it, your majesty. Coldreach breeds nothing but this." Isara did not yet know the name of the man who owned that gentle voice. But the king raised a hand and the guards stopped. "Death is a mercy," he said, and his voice did not shake, which was somehow worse. She will not have a mercy. He rose and looked down at the cursed woman the way a creditor weighs a debt he has just decided how to collect. You wanted to touch what is mine, he said. Then you will be mine. You will be my wife, and you will stand at my side in this hall every day of your life, and every day you will remember whose sister you murdered to get there. He reached down and took her by the wrist to haul her up before the court, bare skin, his hand around the pulse of her, and Isora braced for the scream, and the frost and the ruin she had spent her whole life preventing. None came. For one impossible heartbeat, the cold in her did not answer his hand at all. She was too far gone in terror to understand what that meant. But he felt it too. She saw it cross his face, confused and unwilling, there and gone. Then he let her go as though she had burned him. The killing cold rushed back into her fingers, and the doors of Hellgrave swallowed her whole. They did not put her in a cell. That was the first thing Isora learned about her punishment, that it was to be furnished. They gave her a room with a fire she was not permitted to sit close to, and a window over the yard, where the household looked up at her and looked quickly away. A woman sent to dress her would not meet her eyes. Isora, who had spent her life being the thing other people stepped around, understood the shape her days would take now. Not a rope, not a blade. A slow life in a house that hated her. Married to the wolf who hated her most, until the hating wore her down to nothing. She sat very still and made herself think, because thinking was the only tool she had left. She had not killed Sunniva. She knew it the way she knew her own name. The cold in her hands did not work in a heartbeat. It worked over hours. The slow theft of warmth from a thing until none was left to steal. It had never once stopped a beating heart between one breath and the next. Whatever killed the girl had done it fast and left frost behind to wear her face, and frost like that did not come from nowhere. Someone had put it there, had wanted a cursed woman in that hall, at that moment, near enough to blame. Someone in this house had murdered the king's own sister and pulled Isora's curse over the crime, like a coat over a corpse. They had done it so well that not one soul in Venmark would believe the lair out of the cold reached dead over the grief of an alpha king. If she said a word of what she knew, she would only be the cursed woman inventing lies to save her neck. So she would be silent and watchful and patient. A person learns patience tending the dead. The dead are never in a hurry. But under the cold logic something older ached, and she made herself look at it, because she had never been a coward about the truth. She was to be a wife. She, who had gone her whole life certain she was a thing to be contained and never a thing to be held. Now she would stand each day beside a husband she could kill with a brush of her hand, in a marriage built to be a punishment and nothing else. The one place she could never belong was the one place she was now chained. She thought of the moment his hand had closed on her wrist, and the absence where the cold should have been. She could make nothing of it, and set it aside as a trick of terror, the way the dying sometimes swear the room has gone warm. The door opened without a knock. The soft-voiced man from the hall came in, and this time she saw him plainly, old and kind-faced, dressed in the gray and iron of the king's house, easy as a man never once told to wait outside a door. He looked at her the way a farmer looks at a wolf caught in a snare, without heat, only calculation. "I am Lord Selwyn," he said. "I raised the king when his father could not." He crossed to the window, careful to keep the width of the room between them. "A terrible day," he said, gazing down. "He has buried a father and a sister inside a single year, and married a curse to spite the second grave. I argued against it. I wanted you dealt with cleanly. He is softer than he lets the court see." Softer, Isora thought, looking at the man who had just called her death the kind option. She said nothing. "You will want to be careful with him," Selwyn went on, gently. "Grief makes even a good king cruel. Give him no reason, and perhaps he tires of the game before it tires of you. He turned and smiled at her, and the smile was warm, and it was the coldest thing she had felt since the ice house of Coldreach. Rest, child. They will come for you at dawn. He left. Isora understood that she had just been warned by the second most dangerous person in Hallgrave to fear the first. At dawn they came to dress the cursed woman for her wedding. A wolf binding is not a thing of words. Words can be taken back. That was the whole point of it, and Isora understood the cruelty of his choice the moment she saw the rite laid out in the grey hall. He had not chosen the quiet vows a lord might one day quietly annul. He had chosen the old binding, the one their kind did not undo, sealed not with a ring, but with a hand. They stood before the whole court in the hall where his sister had died, on stone that had been scrubbed, but not, Isora thought, forgiven. He wore the iron and the grief like armor. She wore gray and gloves, and the calm she had learned over 100 corpse tables, the only thing left that was truly hers. The binder, an old woman with wolf marks inked up both arms, spoke the shape of it. The two would clasp bare hands. The binder would speak the words over the joining. And the bond, once set skin to skin, would hold until death, unbreakable by any court, any king, any prayer. Bare hands. Isora looked at the king and understood exactly what he meant to do. He meant to take her killing hand before all of them, meant the curse to come, wanted the court to see the frost climb his wrist and hold, to watch him endure it without a flinch, so that every soul in Venmark carried away the same picture, the Iron King chaining the monster to himself with his own suffering flesh. It was a magnificent cruelty. It would cost him a maimed hand and buy him a legend, and he plainly thought it a fair trade. She wanted to warn him, and hated that she wanted to. He had condemned her for a murder she had not done and dressed her for a lifetime of it, and still some worn-out, decent part of her did not want to freeze a man's hand black while a court applauded. But there was no warning him. There was only the binder's nod, and the king peeling the glove from her right hand himself, finger by finger, his eyes on hers the whole time, daring her to look away. He took her bare hand in his. Isora shut her eyes and waited for the scream. It did not come. What came instead went through her like nothing had in her guarded life. Warmth. His hand was warm around hers and stayed warm, and where their skin met the cold in her did not go out to kill. It went quiet. It drew back. It lay down in her like a beaten dog going still at a master's voice. Her killing hand was warm inside another person's hand for the first time since she was a child, and no frost climbed his wrist, and no blue touched his lips, and the man she was being chained to as a punishment was the only living thing she had ever touched that did not begin to die. Her eyes flew open. His were already on her, and she saw her own shock answered there, wide and unguarded and without any understanding at all. He felt it too. Whatever this was, he knew no more of it than she did. For one long breath, the binding words washed over both of them unheard, and they only stared at each other across a joined hand that should have been a horror and was instead, impossibly, the warmest thing in the room. Then the binder said the last word, and it was done, and the hall roared its grim approval at the sight of their king holding the monster's bare hand and taking, they thought, no hurt at all. They thought him strong. They thought her cowed. They could not know he had just felt a lifelong curse lie down at his touch and had no idea what it meant. Alaric released her. The cold poured back into her fingers so fast it ached. And in that ache, Isora understood the thing that would rule the rest of her life, the thing she must guard now more fiercely than she had ever guarded her gloves. The one man in all the world she had been chained to as a punishment, the husband who despised her, whose sister the court believed she had killed, was the only person alive whose touch could set her free. and he must never learn it. Across the joined silence as the court cheered a mercy that was really a cage, she caught Lord Selwyn watching the two of them from beside the dais. Not cheering, not grieving. Only watching the place where their hands had been, with the still, careful attention of a man who has seen something he did not expect, and is deciding what it is worth. The morning after a wolf binding, so the custom went, the two woke as one pack, warm and tangled and joined. Isara woke alone on a cot at the foot of a bed she had not been invited into, and understood the whole of her marriage from that one cold fact. The fire had burned down in the night, and no one had come to build it up. A wife in this house, it seemed, was a thing to be housed and never warmed. She was still learning the size of it when the summons came. The king would see his wife. She braced for whatever cruelty the daylight had sharpened overnight, gloved her hands, and went. He was waiting in a bare stone room with the door shut, and no guard inside it, which frightened her more than a full guard would have. He did not offer her a seat. He stood at the far wall with his arms folded and looked at her the way she looked at a death she could not explain, as if she were a wrongness he meant to solve or be rid of. "What did you do to me?" he said. "At the binding. What did you do?" "I did nothing," she said, which was true and useless. "Everything you touch dies." He said it flatly, a fact he had been handed and made to swallow. "I have heard it from every mouth in this hall since I was a boy. A cold reach cold witch. Keep her gloved and keep her far." And then you put your bare hand into mine before the whole court, and I felt the cold in you stop. He took a step closer. "So do not stand there and tell me you did nothing." Isara's heart was going hard, because he was right, and because the truth was more dangerous than any lie she could invent. She chose a piece of it. "I cannot explain it," she said. "I have touched hens and hounds and grown men, and everyone began to die beneath my hand. There is no trick I know. In my whole life there has been one exception, and he is standing in front of me scowling, and I promise you, I want to understand it less than you do." She watched him decide whether to believe her. Then, because he was not a man who would trust rumor over his own senses in a matter this strange, he did the thing she had been dreading. He stripped the glove from his right hand and held it out, palm up, in the narrow space between them. "Again," he said, "so I know I did not imagine it." She could have refused. He could not truly have forced her, not without dragging in the witnesses she would then have had to explain the truth to. But she was so tired of gloves, and the pull of the thing was already in her, low and shameful and bright, and she set her bare hand into his palm. The warmth came the way it had in the hall, sure and immediate, the killing cold in her going quiet as a settled child. She heard him breathe out through his teeth. For one moment neither of them was a king or a monster. They were only two people holding hands in an empty room, equally undone by a thing they could not name. He let go first. He always would. "There is a use for you yet," he said, and the iron came back down over his face. "My sister lies in the vault below this hall, and no one will lay her out. They are afraid of the frost that came upon her." He looked at Isora without a scrap of mercy. "You put it there. You will take it off. You will prepare her for the fire yourself, with those hands, and you will think on what you did every moment that you do it." He meant it as the cruelest errand he could set her, and she let him believe it landed that way. But the dead had never frightened Isora, and Sunniva least of all, and a part of her, cold and certain and wide awake, had been aching to get her hands on that body since the moment it fell. They took her down to the vault, to the stone table and the small still shape upon it, and left her alone with the sister she was said to have killed. Isora drew back the linen and began, gently, to read. Her hands went slow, then still, because the death was written plainly on the girl for anyone who knew the language, and it did not spell frost. The blue had settled in the wrong places, the nail beds and not the lips. The stiffening had come far too soon for a death by cold. There was no deep rime in the flesh where her own curse always left it, only a thin bright crust laid over the skin like sugar hardened on a cake. And when she leaned close above the parted lips, she caught it, faint and sweet and bitter at the back, the smell she had first met in a cold reach stillroom over a jar marked for the killing of rats. Sunava had not been cursed. Sunava had been poisoned, cleverly, by a hand that knew exactly how to dress a murder in a monster's coat. And there was not one soul in all of Hallgrave that Isora could tell. She carried the secret up out of that vault like a live coal held in a bare palm, and she told no one, and she watched. It was not hard to watch. A cursed queen no one will stand within reach of is given a great deal of quiet in which to see things. She saw that the king ate little and slept less. She saw the way his gaze moved through a room, counting the doors, weighing the faces, a man forever braced for a blow he was certain was still coming. She saw the taster who trembled, and the steward whose accounts never quite met in the middle, and the smooth gray figure of Lord Selwyn moving through all of it like oil across water, touching everything, troubled by nothing. Whatever Isora had learned in that vault, Alaric of Venmark plainly knew there was something rotten in his own house too, and had known it far longer than she had. He took to keeping her close. Not from any softening, she told herself, but from sense. A wife bound skin to skin cannot easily be reached by a poisoner working through a cup, and near him her killing cold stayed strangely quiet, and a king who cannot be harmed by the one pair of hands his enemies fear most has found himself a shield no assassin would ever think to search. She was a wall he could set his back against. She understood it plainly, and she stood. They were crossing the old lower court at dusk, the two of them and a single guard, when the wall earned its keep. The guard folded to the stones without a sound. Then there were men in the blue dark where no men should have been, 3 of them, quick and quiet and rapt to the eyes. Isora had time to understand that they had come for the king, and then no time to understand anything else at all. A blade went for Alaric's throat, and she did the one thing she had sworn, her whole life, that she never would. She caught the man by his bare wrist and let the cold out on purpose. It left her like a held breath finely loosed, all of it at once, and the man made a sound she knew she would hear again in the worst of her nights, and by the time he struck the ground the frost had whitened his sleeve to the elbow, and no warmth would ever come back into that hand. The other 2 checked. One full heartbeat at the sight of what the cursed queen truly was. Alaric did not check at all. He took the nearer man down with his own hands, hard and final, and the last one turned and ran, and the court was all at once ringingly empty. Isora stood shaking with her bare hand still lifted and the cold roaring back into her, sick to the stomach with the old horror of what she was, and what she had just done with it. She waited for her husband to look at her the way the whole world had always looked at her. He did not. He looked at the dead man and then long into the dark where the runner had gone, and his face carried no surprise at all. Only a grim and tired confirmation, the look of a man who has at last laid a hand on the edge of a thing he long knew was stalking him. "You expected this," she said. Her voice did not sound like her own. "Someone wants you dead, and you knew it, and you walked out here with a single guard regardless." "I wanted to see their faces," he said, still watching the dark. "You made yourself the bait." He turned then and looked at her, and there was something in his eyes she had no name for. Something that was neither fear nor hatred, and unsettled her far more than either would have. "You killed a man for me just now," he said quietly, "with the very hand they would have hanged you for your whole life long. Why?" She had no answer that was safe to give, so she gave him none. She drew her glove back over her fingers, And from that hour she began to keep a careful and steadily growing count of everything about her husband that refused to add up. The winter deepened, and so did the puzzle, and so, though she fought it the whole way down, did the thing she had no business feeling. She investigated him the way she knew best, patiently and from the edges, the way she read a body. She learned that the old king, Alaric's father, had died in the spring of a wasting that no physician could put a name to. She learned that Sunniva had died in the autumn with frost upon her collar. She learned that in the short space between, a young man had buried the last of his blood, looked around a hall full of loyal and grieving faces, and understood that one of them had done it, and that he could not say which. And slowly she came to understand the shape of the man she had been chained to. Not iron, after all. Iron under siege, which is a very different thing. He kept touching her. That was what she could not think her way past. A hand at her elbow that stayed a breath past the steadying. Her bare fingers folded into his in the dark of a corridor when he believed no one was near, taken not to test the curse any longer, but simply, plainly, because he could not seem to stop. Each time the cold in her lay down like a tamed thing. Each time she let it. Each time she despised how much she was already waiting for the next. "You should wear the gloves less," he said to her once, low in a doorway. "I should wear them always," she said. "You are a fool, Your Majesty, and one day you will be a dead one." Possibly, he agreed, entirely unbothered, and did not let go of her hand. One night she could not stop shivering. She never truly could. The cold that killed the world lived first in her own bones, and no hearth had ever once reached it. And she had spent so many years being cold that she had quietly stopped believing warmth was a thing that happened to people made as she was. He found her at the window with her arms locked around herself, and her lips gone the faint blue she knew far too well on other faces. He did not say anything clever. He crossed the room and took both her bare hands into both of his and held on. The warmth climbed her arms and into her chest and up behind her eyes, and Isora, who had laid out the frozen dead without a flinch, who had killed a man 3 nights gone without a single tear, stood in a cold stone room and wept like something breaking open, because for the first time in the whole of her remembered life, she was warm and held and killing no one at all. He did not let go. For once in his guarded life, the king simply held on. "I did not do it," she said into the dark between them, because the warmth had loosened something she could no longer keep shut. "Your sister. I did not do it," whatever the frost set upon her. She felt him go still, and was certain she had ruined everything. Then he only closed his hands the tighter around hers and said, in a voice gone low and rough and strange, "I am beginning to think a great many things in this house are not what the frost says they are." It ought to have been the safest she had ever felt. It was, in truth, the most dangerous, and she knew it even as she leaned her weight into him. Because she had let herself be warmed by the one man in all the world she could never keep, inside a marriage built for the breaking of her, while somewhere in these same walls the hand that had killed his laughing sister was still curled around the jar. 2 mornings after, searching the disused physic stores for a salve, her gloved fingers closed on a small cold jar shoved to the back of a high shelf. She knew the weight of it before ever she read the mark. And the mark, when she turned it into the light, was the mark of a cold-reach still room. The killer of rats. The sweet and bitter death that could counterfeit the cold. It was here, inside the house. It was very nearly empty, and whoever had spent the missing half of it upon a laughing girl in the autumn still held the rest, and still had a king left to spend it on. Before we go on, if Isora and her Frost King have their hooks in you the way his warmth had its hooks in her, take one moment and follow this channel. It is the one small thing that keeps stories like this one finding their way to you. Now, back to the cold hall, and the night it all cracked open. The thaw had become a habit, And habits, Isora knew, were how the careful got themselves killed. It happened on a night with no danger in it at all, which was somehow how it happened. He came to her rooms with no errand and no threat, only a flask of something warm and an excuse so thin they both let it fall unspoken between them. They sat. They did not speak of poison or dead sisters, or the count she was keeping under her ribs. He took her bare hand across the small table, the way he did now, and the cold lay down. And for a while the Frost Queen of Venmark was only a woman warm in her own skin, laughing low at something dry he had said. Then she looked up, and he was already looking at her, and the laughter went out of the room, and left something far more dangerous standing in its place. He kissed her. Or she kissed him. Afterward, neither of them could have sworn to which, and it did not matter, because the moment their mouths met the last of the cold in her went out like a candle pinched between two wet fingers, and she was warm all the way through as she had never once been in her life, warm and wanted and holy, painfully alive. What she felt in him then was not a king's cold regard, and it was not a punishment's cruelty. It was simply the way a person looks at someone they cannot bear to lose, plain and helpless and turned toward her. She had never once in her life been the thing a person wanted to keep. She had only ever been the thing they feared, the thing they stepped around, the thing they buried other people with. And for the whole length of that quiet moment she let herself believe she might be the first thing and not the second. That was the mistake. She felt herself believe it. She felt the old wall come down inside her stone by stone, and the terror that came behind it was worse than any blade she had ever faced, because she knew exactly what she was. She was the punishment, the monster he had chained to himself before a cheering court to remember his sister by. Whatever this warmth was, a man like him did not keep a woman like her. And the moment she forgot, it would be the moment the world remembered it for her. Cruelly, the way it always had. She had survived her whole life by never once believing she could be loved. She would not be unmade now by a warm hand and a thin flask of wine. She pulled back so hard the chair scraped stone. "Do not," she said. Her voice came out as cold as the thing that lived in her hands. "This is not real, and you know that it is not. You married me to torment me. You said it yourself, before them all. Every day of my life I would remember whose sister I killed." She made herself say it, the lie the whole court believed, because it was the only wall she had left that was tall enough. So do not sit here warming my hands in yours and call it something kinder than it is. I am your punishment, your majesty. Have the decency to keep me one. She watched it land. She watched the open thing in his face, the rare and unguarded thing she had spent weeks coaxing into the light, close over like ice going across still water. He had let her see the man beneath the iron, only for a moment, and she had taken that moment and driven it back into him like a knife between the ribs. He rose. He was the king again, entirely, all the warmth withdrawn to somewhere she could not follow. "As you wish," he said, very quietly, and he left, and he took the warmth of the whole room out the door with him. Isora sat alone in the cold that rushed back to fill the space he had left, and told herself she had done the only safe thing there was to do. She almost believed it, but safe had never once been the same as right, and she still carried a jar of poison in her mind, and a husband she had just shoved back toward the very hand that meant to kill him, with no shield now left standing anywhere between the two. The attempt came 4 nights later, and it was patient, and it was clever, and it very nearly worked. Alaric had slept badly since his father died. The whole house knew it, and so every night a cup of steeped valerian was carried up the tower stair to bring him gently down into sleep. Isora knew this the way she now knew everything about him. From the edges, from the long patient watching, that was the only thing her days were good for. What she had not known until she crossed the night steward on the stair and the draft off his tray touched her face was that tonight the cup smelled faintly, sweetly, bitterly wrong. She did not think. Thinking would have been slower than the thing already moving in her. She was through his door without a knock, and the cup was already lifted in his hand, an inch from his mouth, and she crossed the room in 4 strides, and struck it clean out of his grip, so that it burst against the hearthstones. The dark liquid hissed across the hot stone and gave its whole smell up to the room at once, sweet and bitter at the back of the throat, and she watched him catch it, watched the understanding go through him cold and complete. "Nightshade dressed up as sleep," she said, her heart going hard against her ribs. "The same hand, the same jar I found in your stores. Someone in this house has been feeding you your own death, a careful spoonful at a time, small enough to look like grief and sleeplessness. And tonight, for some reason, they grew impatient and poured the whole of it." He looked at the stain spreading dark across his hearth. Then he looked at her, and there was no surprise in it, only a great and terrible weariness. "You keep saving my life," he said, "for a woman who insists at every turn that she is nothing to me but a punishment." She had no answer she was willing to give to that. He crossed to her, and this time, careful of the wall she had thrown up between them, he did not reach for her hand, and the absence of it hurt her more than she had any earthly right to feel. "Listen to me now," he said low. "I know who is doing this. I have known, or very nearly, for a long and useless time. But knowing a thing and proving it are 2 different countries, and the man doing it carries an old name and older friends, and half the lords who sat at meat in my hall tonight would follow him over me if he lifted his hand and asked. If I move against him with nothing but my certainty, there will be blood on these stones by morning and a war on the northern road by the first thaw of spring. So I have to ask you the single hardest thing I have ever asked of another living soul. Say nothing. Change nothing. Go on exactly as you are, and let him believe a while longer that he is winning. Can you do that? Can you give me that much?" And Isora, who trusted almost no one left alive, looked at the man who had caged her and warmed her, and twice now nearly died in front of her eyes, and against every instinct she owned, she said yes. She lasted 1 day. It was not that she meant to break her word. It was that she could not lie down in the dark and do nothing while a jar of counterfeit cold sat somewhere in these walls with a king's name on the side of it. If she could find that jar, the whole of it, and set it beside the near empty one from the physics stores, she would put his proof in his hand herself, and he would not have to be poisoned a 3rd time and trust to her nose to earn it. She knew the house now. She knew the way a careful man kept his careful things, and she knew, the way she knew cold in the bone, that this death had been brewed in a still room, and there was exactly 1 still room in all of Hallgrave that no living servant was permitted to set a foot inside. She went at the dead middle of the night, gloved and silent, the way she had once walked 100 rooms full of the frozen dead. The lock was old and stiff, and she was more patient than any lock, and at last it gave and the door swung inward on the dark. And there, in the black heart of the forbidden still room, with a shuttered lamp held low in one hand and an open ledger and a cold and terribly familiar jar cradled in the other, stood her husband. Isora's whole body went to ice that had nothing to do with her curse, because in that frozen instant there was only one story a pair of eyes could tell, the father dead of a slow wasting, the sister dead of a false frost, the throne that had come to him from both graves at once, and now the king himself, alone at midnight in the poisoner's locked room, with the poison in his bare hand. Alaric went very still. Then he said, low and even, and without moving toward her at all, "It is not what your eyes are telling you it is." For a breath, the only sound in the still room was the small hiss of the shuttered lamp, and Isora stood in the doorway with her whole life rearranging itself, fast and sickening, around the worst shape it could possibly take. Then Alaric set the jar down upon the table, slowly, deliberately, so that she could watch his hands do it, the way a man moves when he knows exactly how he must look and cannot afford to be misread. "I am not the one killing my family," he said. "I am the one who has spent 3 years trying to prove who is. Come and look, if you can bear to. I would far rather you saw it with your own eyes than carried what you believed just now for the rest of your life." She did not want to cross that room. She made her feet do it. Laid out across the still-room table in the low light was not the work of a poisoner but of a hunter. Ledgers, lists of who had bought what, and when, from the northern traders. A patient tally of every dose and every death, every gift of wine and cup of sleep that had gone up to a royal mouth across 3 long years. And at the center of it, in a close hand she did not know, ran a column of purchases of one sweet and bitter powder, the quiet killer of rats, stretching back long before Sunniva ever fell laughing in the great hall. "This is his room," Alaric said, very quietly. "Lord Selwyn's. He tends it himself and lets no servant near it, and now you understand why. He raised my father. He loves to remind the court. He raised me after. He held my father's hand through every night of the wasting, one spring into the next, and wept the loudest of anyone at the pyre, and all the while he was measuring out the very powder that did the killing. He murdered my father to set a frightened boy on a throne he could steer with 2 fingers. He murdered my sister the season she grew old enough to look at him clearly and ask the wrong questions. And he means to murder me the moment he has bled this kingdom past saving and found a tamer wolf to hang the crown on." Isora looked down at the long, meticulous record of a whole family murdered slow, believed every word of it, and felt the floor of her understanding drop away beneath her. Because it fit. It fit the vault and the jar and the gray figure moving like oil across still water. It fit everything except the one piece she could not yet force into place, which was herself. "Then why me?" she said, and her voice had gone strange and far away in her own ears. "If you knew, or so nearly knew, then why did you let them lay it on me? Why did you stand up in that hall in front of everyone and chain me for a murder you already half suspected was his?" And here Alaric, who had faced down 3 assassins in a dark court without so much as a flinch, found that he could not look at her. "Because he handed you to me," he said. He told her the rest with his eyes fixed on the ledger, because he could not tell it to her face. How it had been Selwyn who first turned up the cursed woman's name in the tithe rolls, and Selwyn who arranged for her to be brought up out of the ice house to serve in the great hall on that day. Of all the days, the one day the whole court would be gathered and watching. How, the instant Sunniva dropped with frost blooming at her collar, it had been Selwyn's sorrowing voice already at the grieving king's shoulder, laying the answer down before Alaric's reeling mind could shape the question. A Coldreach cold witch. Coldreach breeds nothing but this. How the certainty of her guilt had never once risen in Alaric on its own. It had been poured into him, drop by careful drop, by the one man he had trusted with his whole life, in the single hour he was least able to think for himself. "I was 19 when my father died," he said, "and 20 when they burned my sister in the yard. I had lost every soul that was mine, and the man who raised me from a pup stood a monster in front of me and told me, weeping, that she had done it. And I was too broken to do anything but believe him. Marrying you to punish you was the cruelest thing I have ever done in my life, and it was his notion before it was ever mine. He wanted you kept alive, and kept blamed, and kept near. A living answer he could point one finger at whenever he needed it, for the rest of both our days, and I gave you to him to be that." He lifted his head and looked at her at last. "But I will not stand here and hide behind a dead man's scheme. I looked at you across the body of my sister, and I did not see a woman who had been used by someone cleverer than us both. I saw a thing that I could hate, and I was grateful to have it. That part of it he could never have forced into me. That part was only ever mine. And there it was, the whole shape of it laid bare, and it was so very much worse than any simple lie could ever have been. Because Isora had spent the whole length of her life certain of exactly one thing, that she was a danger to be contained, and never a person to be held, a thing to be gloved and managed and blamed and set apart from the warm world of the living, and here at last was the hard proof of it, delivered gently into her hands by the one man who had briefly, cruelly, made her dare to doubt it. She had let herself be warmed by him. She had let herself, for the whole length of one single kiss, believe that she might be a thing a person could truly want. And the entire time she had been standing exactly where a murderer had set her down to stand, speaking exactly the lines a murderer had written for her, and even the man who now swore before her that he believed her innocent had taken one look at her over a corpse, and known at once, in his blood and his bone, that she was the guilty kind of creature. "You believed it," she said, and the tears came at last, and for once in her life she let them fall. "You did not even hesitate over it. He set me down in front of you, and you looked at me, and you simply knew." That is the one piece he could never have forced, Alaric. That is what you saw the first time you ever saw my face. Isora? He came a single step toward her, and she stepped back from him, and he stopped at once, the way he had always stopped for her. "You warmed my hands between yours," she said, "and you told me a great many things in this house were not what the frost made them look. And I let myself believe, like a fool, that you meant me among them. But I am exactly what the frost said I was. You knew it the first moment you laid your eyes on me, and every kind and gentle thing you have done for me since is nothing but a decent man trying to pay down a debt he understands he can never truly clear." She dragged the back of one glove hard across her wet face. "I do not want to be your debt, husband. I have been the useful monster the whole of my life. I find that I will not go on doing it wearing a crown." She turned for the door. "Isora," he said, and the name cracked clean in his mouth. "Please. There is poison loose in these walls and a foreign envoy already on the northern road, inside the week, and I cannot," he caught himself, one word too late. "I cannot do this thing without you." And even then, standing there with her heart in broken pieces on a poisoner's floor, she heard the exact shape of it, and it undid the last of her. It was not "I am sorry." It was not "Do not go." It was "I need you." Of course it was. It was the only thing anyone had ever needed her for. "Then you had best find yourself another shield," she said, and she walked out of the light and into the dark. He was waiting for her in the cold corridor, of course. Men like Selwyn were always already waiting in the dark ahead of you. "Child," he said, stepping out of a black doorway as smoothly as though he had grown there in the night. "You have been weeping. Come away from that door and walk with me. Whatever he has done to wound you tonight, I did try to warn you, on your very first evening in this house, that he would." And Isora, who had just an hour past seen his own handwritten plain across 3 unbroken years of murder, understood in a single freezing flash of clarity exactly what was happening here, and let her wet face crumple the whole rest of the way, and let the monster who had made her gather her gently in against his side. He walked her slow along the cold gallery and poured his poison into her ear the same practiced way he had once poured it into a grieving boy of 19. Alaric had never for one moment believed her innocent, he murmured. Being a wolf, he had known from the first night that a cursed woman's cold could not stop a heart in a single beat, and had married her regardless, coldly, to set a wall of frost between his own throat and the blade he felt coming. She had been a shield to him and never one thing more. Every warm word had been a lie told to keep the shield in its place. Did she not see now how she had been used? Every word of it was a lie, and every word of it had been stitched together out of a thread of the truth, which was the thing that had always made Selwyn what he was. And Isora wept and leaned into him and let him believe he had turned her at last, because a broken woman is the one tool a man like that can never stop himself reaching for, and she meant to be ready in his hand at the moment he closed his fist. "There is a way to set all of this right," he told her, so very gently, his old voice warm against her hair. "In 3 days the envoy of the Southern Reach comes to a great feast in the hall, and every lord of Venmark with him. You will stand before them, wronged queen that you are, and tell them plainly what manner of man your king is, a wolf who murdered his own blood for a crown and wed a cursed girl to hide behind. They will believe the grieving queen where they would never believe an old grey counselor. Name him, and he falls, and I will see you carried safe out of it, and set free of him forever." "I will do it," Isora said, and let her voice shake by exactly as much as the old man needed to hear it shake. "I will stand up and name him before every last one of them." And she saw the small pleasure move like a fish beneath his kind old eyes, and knew past any doubt what he truly meant to do. He did not want her to accuse Alaric of some old unprovable murder. He meant to kill the king outright at that feast, before the foreign court, with the counterfeit cold, and let the watching world see the Frost Queen's husband drop dead of frost across his own high table, so that this time the blame would need no whisper at his shoulder. She was not to be his weapon. She was to be the thing they found standing over the cooling body. So she let the old man lead her, waited out the 3 long days, and did the one thing she had ever truly been good at. She watched. The feast was a blaze of light and noise in the cold gray hall, the long tables loud with the same lords who had never once looked at her without the ward against ill luck. The southern envoy seated grand and wary at the high table. Alaric sat at the head of it, wearing iron and grief like a suit of plate, and did not once look at her down the room because she had asked him not to. And Selwyn moved through the whole shining scene like oil across still water, troubled by nothing, and at the turn of the meal, Isara watched the old man lift the king's own wine cup down off the board with his 2 kind hands and begin to carry it, so dutifully, up the length of the hall toward the king. She was already on her feet and moving. "My lords," she said, and her voice, trained and tempered across 100 silent rooms full of the listening dead, carried the whole length of that roaring hall and stopped every fork and every jest dead in the air. "My lords of Venmark, and honored envoy of the Southern Reach, before the king lifts that cup to drink, there is one thing this court has never once been told, and I am the single soul left alive who is able to tell it to you plainly." Selwyn turned in the sudden ringing silence with the cup held out in his hands, and across his face, for the first time in all the months she had known him, went a flash of true and naked fear. "I am the Frost Queen," she said, and let the whole hall look its fill. "Every one of you believes I killed the Princess Sunniva with these 2 cursed hands. Then hear the single fact that breaks the back of that lie. The old king, this king's own father, died of a slow and nameless wasting a full year and more before ever I crossed into Venmark. I was tending the frozen dead in a Cold Reach ice house the night he took his first bad turn, and a woman cannot poison a king she has never stood within 100 miles of. She let it settle, then drew the knot tight. And yet the same death that took the father, sweet and bitter beneath a false crust of frost, took the laughing daughter in this hall, and waits in that cup right now. One hand carried all 3. It was never a cursed girl newly come in the spring tithe. It was a hand already in this house, and in that locked still room, long before I came. Search his rooms, my lords, tonight, this hour, while he stands here and cannot reach them. See whether you find a wronged old servant, or 3 years of a murdered family measured out in powder. The hall erupted into an uproar, and Alaric, who had waited a cold, patient year for exactly this one moment, rose up from his place at the head of the table and said, in the low voice that had never once in his life needed raising, "Do it." And it was the king's own guard who moved at once for the still-room stair, and not one man of Selwyn's. She saw the instant the old man understood he had lost it all. The long-practiced kindness slid off his face like a mask whose string is cut, and the thing beneath it was not kind in any part, and it looked down at the poisoned cup in his hands and up at the king. And she understood he meant to finish it anyway, to dash the cold death into Alaric's throat and drag the wolf down alongside him even now. He lunged for the king, and Isora, who had sworn on every grave she ever closed that she would never again use the terrible thing she was, crossed the last of the space between them in a heartbeat, and closed her bare hand hard around his bare old wrist and let the cold out of her one final time. It went out of her the way it had once gone into a cruel boy in the snow a lifetime ago, all of it at once and without mercy, and Selwyn's arm went white to the shoulder, and the cup fell from a hand that would never hold anything again, and the poison he had so lovingly brewed for a king spilled out harmless across the stones. The old man dropped to his knees before the whole gaping court, frost climbing his throat, staring up in the last of his life at the monster he had found and made and used, and never once thought to fear. "You told me the powder was only ever meant for the rats," she said, low, pitched for his ear and no other in that hall. "You should never have taught a girl who tends the dead exactly what your poison smells like underneath the frost." But Selwyn had kept one last blow in reserve, and with his failing breath he spent it. He turned his whitening face up to the staring hall and laughed, a horrible wet rattling sound, and cried out for every lord and every foreign eye to hear him. "Ask him," he rasped out. "Ask your Iron King why the cold has never once, in all these months, touched so much as a hair of him. Ask him what she truly is to him. She has bewitched your king, my lords, root and branch, and that is the whole reason he stands here shielding his own sister's murderer. Her curse spares him, and him alone in all the world, and you had every one of you best ask yourselves the reason why before you take another breath of her air." And the great hall went utterly silent, and every single face in it swung slowly from the dying man on the stones to the Frost Queen standing over him to the king at the head of the table, and Isora felt the one secret she had guarded above the price of her own life crack wide open in the light of 1,000 burning candles. Every soul in Venmark now knew that the king's touch, and the king's touch alone in all the living world, unmade the killing curse of his cursed and cast-off bride. And she stood there with a dead man's frost still whitening her bare hand, and watched every drop of color drain out of her husband's face, as the whole of the world turned to him at once to see what in the world he would say. For the space of a single held breath, Alaric of Venmark could have taken the easy road, and every soul in that hall would have let him. She saw the whole of it open up clean in front of him, the way she saw the shape of a death open on a cold table. He had only to let the dying man's accusation stand where it had fallen and then turn it in his hand. He had only to name her a witch who had ensnared a grieving king, sever the bond before the court, and have her dragged out of the light, and the lords who feared her would have roared their love to the rafters, and Selwyn, dead on the stones with frost in his throat, would have won the last hand of the long game after all. Isora saw that clean, kingly road unroll before her husband, and she set her own feet and braced to lose one more thing in her life, because losing was the single skill the world had ever permitted her to keep and to practice. He came down off the high seat instead. He came down one slow step at a time, exactly as he had come down toward the body of his sister on the first gray day she had ever laid eyes on him, except that this time he did not stop when he reached the dying man on the floor. He walked past Selwyn as though the old murderer were already nothing but a corpse cooling in the rushes, and he crossed the entire staring length of that enormous hall, past the envoy and past the lords, and past 1,000 held breaths, and he stopped in front of Isora. And there, before the grand southern envoy and every lord of the realm, and every last burning candle in the place, the Iron King reached out and peeled the glove from her frost-cold hand, finger by finger, the same slow way he had once done it to cage her, and he took her bare, killing hand into his. The cold in her lay down at his touch. It always would. It always had. "She is no witch," Alaric said, and his voice went out clear and unhurried to the farthest cold wall of the hall. "Her curse does not spare me because she has enchanted me into sparing her. It spares me because I am hers, and she is mine, in the old way, the true way, the way our grandfathers' grandfathers would have known at a single glance, and this soft and frightened court has let itself forget." He lifted their two joined hands high so that the whole hall could plainly see the bare skin pressed to bare skin and the utter absence of any frost at all upon him. "I bound this woman to punish her," he said, and he gave his own guilt not one single inch of shelter. "I stood on that seat and I called her monster and cage and punishment on the poured-out word of the man who lies dying at my feet this moment for the very murders he built and hung upon her neck. And since that day she has saved my life 3 times over with the very hands the whole of you fear. She has this very hour handed you your true and hidden traitor, at the plain risk of her own life, in front of every one of you. And if her touch finds nothing but warmth in me, and finds only death in every other living soul on this earth, then hear what that truly means, and be ashamed to your bones. It means she was never once the curse that lay upon this house. She was the single thing inside it that was never, ever false." The hall did not cheer. It was very far past the reach of cheering now. It only stood, ashamed and astonished and silent, while the king held the Frost Queen's bare hand up in the candlelight, and the old murderer breathed his last upon the stones, and somewhere down in the great grieving hush of it, Isora understood, slowly, that she had at long last, after all her years, been believed. It should by every right have mended everything. It mended nothing at all, and she was the only person in that whole bright hall who understood the reason why. Because a truth that arrives a full year too late is a colder comfort in the hand than no truth ever was, and the man holding her bare hand up before the world had still, once, looked at her across a body and seen a thing that he could hate, and no confession made before any court on earth could reach back through the months and unsee it for him. She let him hold her hand until the envoy was soothed, and the shaken lords had dispersed to their whispering, and Selwyn had been carried out to whatever cold room would take him. And then she drew her hand, very gently, back out of his, and told her husband that she was leaving. The binding held her fast to Halgrave, and she found that she did not care. She would live within the reach of it and never once within the reach of him. A queen in a far cold wing of the citadel, cleared at last of a murder and emptied out of everything else, and it would still be a wider freedom than she had ever owned before. He did not argue with her. That was the very worst of it. He only looked at her with the whole of the man beneath the iron laid bare and open and undefended, and he said, in a voice gone quiet as snow, "Then I will not touch you again until you ask me to. Not one single time. You have that as my word, and it is the last thing of mine you might still have cause to trust." And he kept it. Somehow, against everything, he kept it. The weeks went by, and the hard winter began, at last, to think about breaking apart. He cleared her name across the whole broad reach of Venmark, and sent riders to every hall and holdfast that had ever spat upon the word Cold Reach. He did not come to her wing. He did not reach down the bond and use it, though she knew now that he could have. That a bound alpha need only lay his will along the thread and call his mate to his side, and she would have had no choice but to come. He never once pulled on it. He left her a freedom that the old binding had never in its cruel design been meant to allow her, and he held that freedom open for her by nothing but the main brute force of his own will, and she told herself every single morning that she was glad of it, and she slept the worse each night for the size of the lie. Then the riders stopped going out, and the letters he had never once sent her went on not being written, and one gray and dripping morning Tamsin, who scrubbed the cold queen's dead hearth, and had never in all these weeks feared her by so much as a hair, and had become, somewhere in the long grinding dark of that winter, the nearest thing to a true friend that Isora had ever kept in her life, set down her heavy pail on the stones, and said the thing that not one other soul in all of Hallgrave would have dared to say. "You should go to him," Tamsin said, "now, before there is no him left to go to." Isora went cold in a way her curse had nothing whatever to do with. "He is wasting," Tamsin said, blunt and flat as a stone dropped down a well. "Like the old king before him, they whisper it in the kitchens, and it is frightening the life out of them. He does not eat, he does not sleep. He sits his own counsel and forgets in the middle of a sentence what he rose to say. The physicians open their books and find nothing, because there is nothing in any book about it." She looked the queen full in the eyes without a flicker or a flinch. "But you are no physician, my lady. You lay out the dead. So you tell me. You tell me what it is that ails a bonded wolf who will not touch his own mate, and will not call her to him down the thread, and will not, whatever it slowly costs him, make her come to his side against her own free will." And Isora, who knew cold and knew death, and knew, to her own grief, exactly what a long-starved bond did in the end to the wolf that had to carry it, was up off the bench and running before Tamsin had finished. She found him in the deep dark of his chambers, folded into the great chair beside a long dead fire, and he was gray. Not the pale gray of his eyes, the other gray. The gray she knew from 100 cold tables, the exact and particular gray of a living thing that has quietly, without any fuss, decided to stop. He had let it come. He had felt the bond starving in him for the want of her, day upon day upon day. And he had sat here alone in the cold and let it hollow him out from the inside, rather than reach one time down the thread and pull her to him, because to reach would have been to make her come, and he had given her his word, before the whole world, that he never would. "You fool," she said, and it came out of her wrecked and shaking. "You stubborn, iron, impossible fool. You would die of it. You would honestly sit here in the dark and die of it, sooner than call my name the once." He turned his head against the chair, and even now, even this far gone, he found somewhere the pale ghost of the dry thing in him that she had first so hated, and had somewhere along the way begun to love. "You told me," he said, his voice barely a thread of itself, "to keep you always as a punishment. And I have never once in all our time managed to give you a single thing that you asked me for." It seemed a poor and graceless hour to begin. And Isora understood at last, standing there in the cold wreck of her own long certainty, that the thing she had been guarding so fiercely all this while had never once been her heart at all. It had only ever been the wall, and the wall had never for one day of her life kept her safe from anything. It had only, faithfully, kept her cold. So she did the thing that mirrored, across all the long and bitter months between, the very first cruelty this whole story had ever shown her. On the day she was first dragged up into Hallgrave, a king had taken her bare hand by main force, before a whole roaring court, in order to cage her and to break her with it. And now, in an empty dark room with no court to watch, and no crown anywhere in sight, and no force in it at all, a cursed woman went down on her knees before a dying man and gathered his cold bare hand up into both of her warm ones, of her own entire free will, and gave him back at last the warmth he had never once, in all his cruelty and all his kindness, thought to use against her. The bond flooded open wide between the two of them, and it did not starve, and it did not kill. It poured warmth both of the ways at once, at long last, hers running down into him and his running up into her, and she felt him draw the first full and unbroken breath he had drawn in weeks, felt the terrible gray begin to loosen its grip upon him, felt the great wolf inside him lift its heavy head at the sudden longed-for return of the one thing it had been slowly dying without. "Do not," she said fiercely, through the tears running hot and unfamiliar down her warming face, "ever do such a thing to me again. Do you hear me? You do not get to hand me back my freedom by dying quietly of it in the dark. That is not a gift that a person gives. It is only a coward's last apology dressed up as one, and I did not choose you at last in order to bury you a week later. Choose me," he repeated, hoarse and disbelieving, holding onto her warm hand now as though it were the single warm thing left anywhere in the whole cold world, which, for him, it truly was. "Yes," she said. "Not because you have cleared my name in every hall in the north, not because the frost spares you and you only, because when the easy and the kingly road was lying right there open at your feet, you stepped down from that seat instead, and told a hall packed full of the men who feared me that I was the truest thing in your house." She pressed his cold hand hard between her two warm ones, willing the warmth of it into him. "A king once bound me to break me, in that very hall, and called it a thing that could not be undone. Well, here then is the taking of it back. I bind myself to you now, of my own will in an empty room, in front of no living soul and for the sake of no crown on this earth, and I will say to you the very words that you once said down to me." She held his fading eyes with all the steady strength she had. "It will not be undone." He laughed, or he wept, or he did the two of them at once, the wet and broken sound of a man handed back a life he had already made his cold peace with laying down, and he turned his gray face into the warm cup of her palm, and he stayed there, breathing her in, and the killing cold that had ruled every single hour of her entire life lay itself quietly down, and this time it did not get back up. The curse did not break all at once, nothing in the world that old and that deep ever does, but it broke. The old binder, when at last they thought to bring the question to her, went gray in the face and reached down a book so ancient that its hinges had rotted clean to powder, and she read them out the true and buried shape of it. The cold curses that ran in the old Coldreach blood had never been an accident of birth, nor any punishment sent down by fate. They had been laid, generations deep, in the bad old wars, by the great southern houses, upon the border folk they had wished first to forge into weapons, and then to blame for the using of them. And every last one of those curses had been keyed shut the very same cruel way, so that it might be broken by one thing in all the world and one thing only, the true touch of a mate bond, which the men who laid them had reckoned, laughing, that no cursed monster would ever in her life be given the chance to find. They had made her untouchable. And then they had made good and certain that the single cure for it was the one thing an untouchable woman could never come near. And Selwyn's own house had been chief among the layers of that cruelty. He had wed her to a king as the cruelest joke of a punishment he could devise, and never once in all his cleverness dreamed that the joke he was making was the key that unlocked her. So it broke, slow, the way a great river breaks in the spring, first from underneath where no eye can see it working, and then all at once and everywhere. She woke one morning in that first true spring and laid her bare fingers against the frost flowers grown across the inside of the window glass, and they did not blacken and curl and die. They only melted gently under the plain human warmth of her hand and ran down the glass like any thaw. She held a new dropped lamb in the muck of the yard, and it stayed warm and struggling in her bare arms and bleated its outrage and lived. She set her palm flat to the bark of the old dead-looking apple by the gate, the way she had once as a child watched a whole hedge go black at her touch. And this time, the tree only stood there being a tree, and come summer, it fruited. She pressed her bare hand over Tamsin's chapped red knuckles one morning without thinking, the way friends do, and caught herself in a heartbeat of the old terror. And Tamsin only turned her hand over and squeezed it, and went on complaining about the draft. Isora learned, one careful living thing at a slow time, to touch the whole wide world again, and every single time it did not die beneath her hand, she wept a little, quietly, and Tamsin always pretended with great dignity not to have seen it. And the whole gray and grieving house began very slowly from the ground up to warm. He earned the rest of it, exactly as she had made him swear he would. He did not presume upon the crown, or the bond, or the good name he had ridden the length of the north to clear for her. He came to her cold wing like a suitor with cold hands and no rights at all to be there, and he asked for her hours the humble way a poor man asks for bread at a warm door, and he brought her no flowers and no jewels and no grand promises, only himself and his dry, quiet talk, and a patience she had not known the iron in him could hold. He never once let the word wife past his lips until the day she said it first to him. He was, it turned out, underneath all of it, a very great fool in love, and had only ever buried the whole of it so deep beneath the iron, because the iron had been the one single thing in all his life that no one had ever yet tried to take away from him. They were wed again in the end, though they had never once been unwed, because Isora found she wanted the second one to be the true one, the chosen one. The one built out of no grief and no lie, and standing upon no dead man's cruel scaffolding at all. It was a small rite, in the thin gold light of a spring afternoon. Tamsin cried without any shame in it whatsoever, and stood up as her witness, and grinned the whole way through the small rite like the sun coming up over a hill. There was no great court gathered to cheer, and there was no monster left to chain, to anyone. When the binder asked her for her bare hand this time, Isora gave it freely, ungloved, into the light, and no one in that small warm room so much as held their breath. There was only a woman who could at long last be touched, marrying the one and only man on the earth whose touch had never for one instant meant her any harm. "You know," he murmured to her, when the words were all said and done, his warm forehead resting against her warm one. "You did propose my undoing first, in the hall, that first night. I have only ever agreed to it. I also saved your life first," she said, "if we are troubling ourselves to keep the account." "We are not," he said, "keeping any account, ever again, the two of us." And she decided, for that once and that once only, not to argue the point with him. The last hard frost of that long winter melted off the iron wolf carved above the great gate, and ran down the gray stone and away, and Isora of Coldreach, who had spent her whole life certain past all argument that she was a thing to be contained, and never once a thing to be held, stood warm in the warm circle of her husband's arms in the thawing yard, and was held, and held nothing at all of herself back from it, and felt, for the first hour she could ever remember, nothing anywhere inside her that needed guarding, and no reason left in all the warming world to keep her gloves.